Hi, I'm Jenny with Kids Learning for Life, and today I'm going to talk to you about my favorite educational podcasts for kids. Podcasts are a really great resource for parents and kids and educators of all kinds, but it's kind of one of those things that people either completely know everything about or they know nothing about podcasts. So I'm kind of making this video for people who don't know anything about podcasts so that you can learn how to integrate them into your homeschool. For me personally, we don't do a lot of screen time in my family, so podcasts are sometimes one of the main sources of entertainment that my kids get, and they love them. There are so many podcasts out there, so I'm going to list some of my favorite ones. I'm going to start with ones that are meant more for younger kids, and then towards the end, I'll list some that are more academic and maybe a little inappropriate for the younger kids that are meant for older kids or high school students. The way we listen to podcasts is typically on their CD player, which does have Bluetooth capabilities. We also have some Bluetooth speakers throughout the house. So there are all sorts of ways you can listen to podcasts. You can even listen to them straight from a device if you don't have a speaker. So they're really accessible and there are so many options to choose from. So let's get started. The first podcast I want to mention is called Julie's Library. Now you may be wondering, who's Julie? But I promise you, you know who she is. It's hosted by Julie Andrews, who I think most of us know her as Mary Poppins or Maria Von Trapp or the Queen from Princess Diaries. And she has just the most beautiful speaking voice. And so this podcast is hosted by her and her adult daughter. And they take turns reading different stories that I believe a lot of them are original or just brand new stories. None of them are very classic stories, which is the one problem I have with the podcast. It's also very new, so there aren't a lot of episodes yet, but my kids love Julie Andrews from all the movies that she's in, and we just love hearing her speak, and it's just such a pleasant thing to listen to. So it's something that we can all kind of enjoy together. The next podcast I want to mention is called Smash Boom Best. This podcast ties into one other podcast that I do know of called Brains On. Brains On is kind of the parent podcast over a few of these that I'm going to mention. So Brains On is a science podcast. Now, I am going to mention it because it is one that my kids do like, but they tend to enjoy the other podcasts that Brains On produces better. So, for example, there's Smash Boom Best, which is basically a debate show. They choose two topics to have people debate over, and it's something really goofy, something you would never debate on in real life. So it's like, which one's better, tigers or lions? Something like that. At the end, they actually do crown a winner, which I think is strange because neither of these things would actually be better than the other one because they're different, but it's just all kind of goofy, but it is a way for kids to learn special facts about different animals or different things in nature. The other podcast under the Brains On umbrella that I wanted to mention is Forever Ago. Now, the only problem with Forever Ago is that they stopped making episodes a few years ago, and I don't know if they're going to continue, but my kids loved this podcast, and I actually really liked it too. It's about like things that we know of now, but how they were formed way back in history. So one of the episodes is about shoes. Now, it's something we don't think about all the time, but who invented the first pair of shoes and how have they evolved over the years? It's interesting and really informative. The last podcast I'm going to recommend that I recommend specifically for younger kids is called Storynory. This podcast tells fairy tales. Some are original and some are classic tales, which I like. And this one, like I said, is meant for younger kids, so older kids might be kind of bored by it. I know I was a little bored by it listening to it with my kids, but it's really cute. It's not obnoxious. A lot of these podcasts can get really loud or use these annoying character voices, and Storynory is just, it's pleasant, it's kind of quiet. I would recommend it if you needed some sort of quiet time for your kids. So they have all sorts of stories. This podcast has been around forever, so there's lots to choose from. Now on to the podcast that I recommend for older kids. The reason I recommend these for older kids is because the content might not be appropriate for younger kids, and These podcasts can really be used in a more academic way once your children can independently write on their own or read on their own or just think a little more critically. The first one I will mention is called Myths and Legends. Now, I made the mistake of listening to this with my 6-year-old. It wasn't a complete disaster, but Myths and Legends is basically just tells in depth the stories about popular myths and legends. So the backstories that you might not actually know. For example, Maui from Moana has this whole backstory that I never heard of. So I put on this podcast episode and I'm like, oh, this will be about the Disney movie. This will be great. And it turns out he was like abandoned by his mother. Everyone's trying to kill him. It just got really intense. Even though a lot of the myths that this podcast talks about are Disney movies or classic fairy tales, they are not necessarily appropriate for kids. So just keep that in mind. But I do like it because it, like I said, it goes in depth about these stories that we feel like we all know, but we really don't. And I would consider it educational for kids who are interested in old stories like that. The next podcast I want to mention is called History of English. Now this is a personal favorite of mine. I really love the study of language, etymology. I like knowing where all these words came from. This is why I'm such a Latin geek. So I found this podcast because I wanted something to play for my kids. Now my kids are way too young to listen to this podcast and be at all entertained, but I would suggest this podcast for high schoolers who are studying the history of the English language. So the podcasts are pretty long. They're about 45 minutes to an hour each, and the podcast guy, the guy who makes this podcast, does it on his own in his free time. He just goes way in depth. I know I keep saying in depth, but that's what the point of podcasts are, is just to go in depth on really niche subjects. He goes in depth on like special subjects about the English language. Like there's one about playing cards. There's one about food terms. There's one about the Canterbury Tales. So there's so much to learn about the history of the English language. I started from episode 1, and I'm slowly making my way through. Full disclosure, I listen to this podcast almost every night when I'm trying to fall asleep. That's not a diss. That is a compliment because I have to actually enjoy something to be relaxed enough to fall asleep to it, and I'm learning things. So, pro tip. The next podcast I want to mention is called Switched on Pop. This is a really fun podcast I found. I'm interested in music theory and appreciation, and this is just one I found perusing on my own. I wasn't even looking for a kid podcast, but the hosts really do make it family friendly. They're talking about modern pop music and breaking it down and showing how the artists use different sounds or different kinds of lyrics or different speech cadences to evoke a feeling and make us feel a certain way, because that's what music is about expressing yourself. So the reason I say it's for older kids is because some of the pop songs could have questionable content. The last podcast I want to recommend for you is called Art History for All. This is my most recent find. I've been interested in art history lately, so it kind of delves into art history. Like, why did this artist paint this certain painting this way? What were their influences? How did it affect culture after that? So Art History for All really dives into all of that. The podcast lady, I forget her name. I wish I had a better term for these people who create podcasts, because it's not just a producer. They are producing it, but they're also writing all this content. It's a lot of work, I'm sure. But she does a really good job of going into all these little things that you thought you knew, but you don't. For example, the first episode that I listened to was about the Mona Lisa. How many of, we all know the Mona Lisa, but what do we really know about the Mona Lisa? I highly recommend it if you have kids interested in art history or if you want to implement art history into your homeschool. So those are a few of my favorite podcasts. Those are not all my favorite podcasts, but those are just a few that I want to recommend right now that I think you could easily implement into your daily routine or your homeschool if you want to formulate lessons around these subjects. I think podcasts are a really underrated way to implement education really easy in an entertaining way for your kids. And also, podcasts are a really fun way to enjoy a lesson together where you both are learning new things. Do you have any favorite educational podcasts for kids? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe to this video to see more like this one. See you next time!